this guy behind you, Shakespeare and the Union. My name is George. I'm the chair of my tonight's scene comes out of producer James by the distinguished, amongst much else, doing fantastic the national on Shakespeare. And I'm saying that what we should talk about hotly debate, and then union.
Union is an idea through that transition from the end by James VI. That he is he's king of Wales, and he's king of Ireland in this something called the Lord Chamberlain. Over the company, writing directly. Is very much as best we think, it's probably written in 1966. After linking it's in England army or kind of unified Scots coming in the film version and we use it in theatre is a in the play scene where he goes version of it there, but in the original happens parade of kings stretching forward, last figure whole. And in the original held America up to show that of that. So it's a history kind of lots of
Straw repeated it to get Parliament to unification, but constantly turning reading and there's it seems to be there wasn't talk about where be rich for Shakespeare.
Yes. It's seen as the first great. I mean, scientists endlessly discuss about when does the emerge, when does nationalism emerge. But there's an argument that says that Shakespeare is the first great period of nationalism. It's tied in with ideas of propaganda and with ideas of printing. You know, so for the first time, you're reading in your own language. You know, that's part of what the Reformation gives you. And that promotes secular in your own language as well. So ideas and identity come together. I think Shakespeare thinks about this a lot, you know. He can't really write about it because it's too politically dangerous. Yeah. what he does is writes about other periods of English history and British history as a way of rehearsing it. You can see it as early as Henry V, 1599, and that scene in Henry V where you have the four captains, it's almost like an old-fashioned joke, an Irish and an English and the Welshmen all fighting together in Henry's army. So even 4 years before James comes to the throne, he's already thinking about what are these individual constituent elements of these two islands. How can they be together? Can they hold? And Shakespeare is not entirely
because even though he's a king's man, in profoundly ambiguous, and the plays are profoundly ambiguous, but profoundly ambiguous and direct. I mean, if we take the king's agenda, Desmond, 1606, it seems to the king's agenda as much as it shows the chaos that counted and then there's the virtuous coming in.
If you look at the type that was published, it says something like play for St. Stephen's night during the High Holidays or something like that. So as it was performed for James, I feel it's like everything shot through with and yes, superficially it seems to be when you define disaster follows. But it's always a thing about it always claimed by the left and claimed by the right. And there's a Shakespeare always. So it gives James one as a whole other narrative.
Over and I know from reading we're pretty keen it shouldn't come to that. So that's the dynamic. Let's stay with James, not in terms of who was in fact
Yes, why do we
both potential for
yes.
it's a back in Elizabeth times I who was and Glendale in Shakespearean way Shakespeare the British
Brutus being related to the name brand.
So we don't if I come all in shape, we move on to times. Society and
every themselves, you know. So by the time you get 1500, and English power is limited to the area of Wales. So what the Tudors tried to do is they tried to push outwards, you know, and rule the island as a whole, if possible, colonizing projects in Munster. You get this double figure, Brian Friel, fluent in courtly manners as well. Fluent in yet he let break when Shakespeare fifth he was working. And O'Neill, in a very complicated way, part of power and fancy really know O'Neill, and it was very upset with him. So O'Neill comes very close to if thrown in 1603. So sense at that point, you know, just the idea of possible.
I want a little while between shows, and because about what the use and interpretation about the use island, if you like.
Yes. Yeah. Just written a great. And so I think Robert very much sees a Scottish project to create in Burns an alternative to Shakespeare, right? So I think Robert feels that there's a press within Scotland for Scotland to have a culture that it can present in opposition to English culture, right? There's also kind of simultaneously another different and slightly weird thing that's going on in that the Scottish universities start teaching Shakespeare before any other universities start teaching Shakespeare, right? And this is tied in with the Act of Union in 1707 and the idea that Scotland is now formally united. You know, there's a union of parliaments from 1707, and that therefore the Scottish universities start teaching Shakespeare so that the Scots who are going down to London can carry that culture with them. Then the second strand, as I say, is the Burns strand of a kind of Scottish pride that says, well, we don't need Shakespeare. We have our own stuff up here, thank you very much. And that makes Scotland quite different from Ireland in a way, it seems to me. There's never been that kind of resistance to Shakespeare in Ireland. And there's never been the same strong sense of needing an Irish culture that was wholly distinct from English culture. So you were talking a little bit there about 1916. And the thing that's very strange about the 1916 rebels, 1916 leaders, was that they were all obsessed with English literature and particularly obsessed with Shakespeare, right? So Thomas MacDonagh, who was one of the leaders executed, was obsessed with Jane Austen, right? So there's a story that before he goes off to take part in 1916, he says to his students at University College Dublin, where he was a lecturer in English, "There's no one like Jane, lads." Right? It's one of the last things.
So Irish rebels are Janeite.
Oh, right, Janeite, exactly. And Patrick Pearse, who was the leader of the Rising, of course, he inherited a copy of Shakespeare from his English father. He performed Shakespeare in the home with his brother and his sisters. They got an early phonogram, which could record as well as play wax cylinders, and they recorded the first act of, I think, Julius Caesar onto this wax disc. He was part of a literary club, and he performed the first act of Hamlet solo at a meeting of the literary club. And he was an obsessive collector of editions of Shakespeare. The Pearse Museum in Dublin has a lot of these editions. So that seems like a very odd and counterintuitive thing, you know, that these guys were separatists, absolute political separatists, and wanted to set up a republic, and yet they were all busily reading Shakespeare and Jane Austen and Chaucer and all that.
Well, that brings us to, in a very natural way, to the now, if you like. I mean, you're based in the Republic.
Mm-hmm.
Do you sense anywhere around you a problem with Shakespeare? And now, in the way you say Scotland's starting to develop its Burn project, because English is seen as definitive English writer, the ultimate heritage definer. Is there in Scotland now?
I think not greater social context in Scotland now means that it's easier to think about what film. I think that go back, there have been a
and plays different stuff. And he's also reason the hours has become
we're just talking there vastly mentioning it's a great monitoring. Bloody very interesting, you know.
very to those strain and that sense of I hope that would play strongly in current. Which I get from your with it being done in caravan. Dressing as I don't want to, he is with us. Trying to break with the,
I mean, same sort of thing, containers, performance. But the range with Shakespeare as a lot, as a it's different versions of Shakespeare in different ages, many of which have been, you know, in the book Stephen O'Neill from this book about Shakespeare. You know, he's looked at lots of different performance bits and pieces and whole plays and other stuff up on you thinking of the aesthetic of that and mean. We were talking earlier about a New York performance which I think is based on Macbeth, which takes place in a hotel in New York. And you put it in your mask is sort of your face. One of the rooms of the form dispersed through the building will come to you and take you. And yet we have.
Last me before I open it out. We talked about the possibility of the disunited and Scotland. If it would happen to Shakespeare
In Scotland, question. Scotland simply did tradition of Shakespeare, as we've said. I was in the codes, you know, and if you uncouple the country, and after separate, but after you separate, it gives you so I think you would probably get a parallel development in Scotland, in which you would
that this distinguished scholar was based, as you probably picked up, he's I'm going to open it out, but I'm going to choose someone to start. In Wales. He's a man who knows Ireland very well, he's a Trinity man, and he's directed in Ireland and of course Shakespeare all over Europe and in London and in Stratford and elsewhere.
Yesterday, he talked for 2 hours.
Yesterday on Shakespeare.
Without getting his head up and
Without,
with the audience.
He's amazing. Michael.
And he hasn't even recognised me today.
Shakespeare and the Union. What does Shakespeare say to you about the Union?
I'd rather answer something else.
You answer whichever question you want to. You're a good politician.
I take issue with this phrase that Shakespeare is ambiguous. I don't believe any artist.
I thought you would.
Well, I don't believe any artist is ambiguous. I don't believe a poet or a musician or a playwright or a painter sets out to be ambiguous. I think they set out to say something very clearly. Now, sometimes they say it in a very convoluted way and in a way that is difficult to comprehend, but somewhere buried in there is a very clear thought in their heads about what they're trying to say. So any ambiguity, it has to be in that old thing of the eye of the beholder, not in the person who's actually created the piece of work. So when you come to Shakespeare, there are so many subjective views as there are of Dylan Thomas, or there are of Van Gogh. When you look at one of his paintings, and you only know yourself from seeing what critics write about a particular performance on a particular night, how apposite they can be, how different they can be. One sees one thing and one sees another. So I belong to the school that says that Shakespeare actually had a very clear agenda. And that clear agenda is sometimes buried underneath what Stephen Greenblatt said, the American critic, a wonderful phrase, a series of invisible bullets. And the insurrection that Shakespeare develops with this series of invisible bullets sometimes says something the very opposite to what we believe he thought about the Union. Now take Macbeth, for example, and the theory that it's a piece of Jane's propaganda. The character of Malcolm is a little shit, and he comes back with an English army to take over Scotland. And the question that interests me is, what deal did Malcolm do with the English in order to get the loan of 10,000 troops? Now, battles were won, fought and lost with 5,000 in those, well, in the later days of the 14th, 15th century. Now we're talking sort of even earlier. So 10,000 today equates to something, I don't know, like 1 million. So what deal did he do? Well, he says, thanes, clansmen, henceforth be earls.
The earls.
The first that Scotland ever named.
Which was one of the big...
Right, so there's the creation of Scotland by this little shit, this dirty work, and who turns out to be the most confident liar of all time, a real politician of a kind that Shakespeare is specialised in. And I believe that in terms of the Union, he looked on Wales in a very benevolent fashion, created a series of heroes like Macbeth, who, supposing his imagination, turned on its head, and the way that he could use language and his action, if that had been put to good use as opposed to bad use, might have had the most extraordinary Scotland, but instead of which, it's going to be run by, as I say, a idiot who's come back to claim a bit of land.
After all. You know, I mean, these things. He plays outside of the house. He's radical. He's, you know, what's things being for handle all the time. There's a very ambiguous sense of the king's evil and all the stuff in Macbeth. Scene is usually cut for dramatic purposes. But nevertheless,
the personal theory says he's a good saint. Why has he got two plans? The Western art, the Norwegian, to get rid of. At the same time, he looks over the as the
stereotyped in terms of nationality. So obviously Welsh characters in Shakespeare, Scottish characters in Shakespeare. For example, I saw a production recently at the RSC of Henry V, in which the Scottish character, the joke about that character was that you couldn't understand a word he was saying because he had a very thick Scottish accent. And I'm wondering if there's something troubling about us marginalising regional characters in Shakespeare and making performance choices to do that in performance. Because after all, the ambiguity, as you say, comes in how we choose to perform these characters in these situations.
are you suggesting that we turn, say, Welsh characters in Shakespeare into comic creations, whereas Shakespeare doesn't write them that way?
Potentially. I'm saying that it absolutely depends on how we perform it. We can't really say this is what Shakespeare meant, because we don't know, but we choose what Shakespeare meant.
You don't quite agree with Michael Bogdanov.
Maybe
He thinks
I'm-
he does
I'm
know
just
exactly
going
what
to-
Shakespeare.
yeah.
Actually, no, I do agree.
Yeah, well, you both and. You know that we do things to Shakespeare, but you also think his intention is there in the writing. What do you think about this ambiguity question?
I think it's interesting what you say, Michael, about what happens at the end of that play. And what I thought was very interesting about the Kurtzl film is that it replays what Polanski did at the end of his film. It's where you get the cycle of violence, the suggestion of the cycle of violence is about to continue again. So that does seem to be built into this film and to the earlier Roman Polanski film. It also feels to me that this film gestures towards, there's a wonderful Titus Andronicus by Julie Taymor, which ends with a child being carried off into the sunlight at the end. So it's a wonderful film with a terrible, terrible, terrible ending. That almost feels to me like a parody of it, that instead of it being the child brought out into the light at the end of this, it's the child going into the blood and the darkness and all the rest of it. So I think you do, and that is there in the play, it seems to me, that it's not at all a definite Jamesian ending, it seems to me. There's a lot of complexity built into that. As to the question of how you play these characters on stage, I think that must be, and I'd be curious to know what you would say to this, Michael, actually, is what decisions do you make about that as a director? If you're going to direct the four captain scene in Henry V, and you've got these characters with caricature accents, are you
What notes do you give to Frelin?
Well, there seems to be a rhythm in Llewellyn that it says that he's North Walian, and he's counterbalanced by the poetic language of Glendower. So you've got a double focus on Wales. He sort of prefigured the hard drinking, bomb toting Irishman.
Yes.
With McMorris.
Yes.
But in Merry Wives of Windsor, there are 12 references to the Welsh and cheese, and Pastor Evans is a Welsh cheese. So there are obviously characteristics that existed then, that lasted 400 years, and we still look at them and say that, oh well, that's a caricature. But actually, there has to be some sort of truth in those things. In fact, we're still thinking that today, and he wrote it 400 years ago. So the decisions that I take are political ones always, in terms of the plays. And Phil, you put your finger on an invisible bullet in Lear, for example, but you juxtapose that with an oxymoron. You said the virtuous Cordelia comes back at the head of the French army.
I was caricaturing.
What is she intending to do with that army? Supposing she conquers Britain, is it going to belong to France?
Well, that's the question.
Yeah, but that's the question that has to be answered in the play.
But I think it's a very divided play. But I think where I always agree, where I always agree with Michael Bogdanov is that I cannot believe sometimes how people talk about Lear, which is in this same year as Macbeth. So we can see where Shakespeare's mind is going. There's a great deal of darkness around. There's a return of plague. Theatres are closed. He's able to write free of the normal constraints sometimes of scene construction, because his mind is going loose, even for someone who's such a completely inuit playwright. It seems to me that the virtue of which this is challenging, has just been under incredible threat from the gunpowder plot in November 1605. So at that very time when people are wanting to shore up the security of the state, he calls the power structure into question. Is that a fair point?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, and it's. again, he's thinking very deeply about these things and the nature of society and consent within society and all those kind of things.
How does that operate? I mean, we know that Jacobean London is about 200,000 people. It's got a lot of theatres, and in the theatre season, as much as 10% of the population is in the theatre, and there are no newspapers, there are no other media. This is where people are feeling their society, are hearing its issues, and we know that it has to be done in a refracted way, because there's a Lord Chamberlain watching. It's dangerous. As I say, Johnson was carted off to jail for a play. What kind of freedom do you see Shakespeare as having? Because on the one hand, he does refract it. He's very careful, puts things in the past, puts it in other countries. On the other hand, this is a very challenging thing, he says in Lear, in a very difficult year. How does he get away with that?
It's a good question. I mean, if you look at something like, Richard II, when Essex launched a kind of coup d'etat, an attempted coup d'etat against Elizabeth, he asked Shakespeare's company to put on, or the Essex faction asked them to put on a production of Richard II, because there is the deposition scene, where Richard gives up the throne to Bolingbroke. And they were severely censured, the company was severely censured for that, but not massively punished. So it's an interesting thing, is how far could you push theatre at the time? What we do know is that when the play was then published, the deposition scene was cut from it. So there were several decades during which you could not publish an edition of Richard II with the deposition scene in the text. So there's a kind of push and pull going on there, I think.
Do we have a last?
Can I ask, Phil, what Macbeth, so this just today in terms of politics?
The film that we've just seen, or Macbeth as a play?
As a play. And the themes are running through it.
Yeah.
That sort of the vaulting ambition. I'm just, it's some kind of prophecy.
Do you see any resonance with what's around you? It certainly doesn't predict Donald Trump, that's for sure.
It doesn't. I think that's a question I'd have to think about. I'm not really sure of an immediate answer to it. I'm sure Michael would have a way of making it very relevant if he were directing.
I tell you what occurs to me, though, I mean, responding to your provocation, is that the very world in which we live, I mean, you come out of the imaginative world we've just been in, and, you don't, part of you doesn't want to have this conversation. I hope by now you sort of accepted it. But part of you just wants to live in that kind of imaginative environment, and you think, what a world, and it's a world that's all around us, a world of huge violence and power grab. But in all our lives, down in the Senate and so on, that's not whatever emotions are. Stabbings, are we? We're not going to see this and the other. So, is there a sense in which, at least in our developed and feeble democracies in the West, it doesn't even feel relevant?
Well, it still feels relevant in Africa. I mean,
Well, yes.
If you see, I don't know if you saw the Baxter RSC Tempest,
Yeah.
with John Carney playing Caliban and his son playing Ariel and Anthony Sher playing Prospero. I mean, that's a play about colonialism, isn't it? And there were 3 South African actors, more actually. Most of the actors were mixed race or black, and it was the greatest theatrical experience I've ever had. And I'm sure Shakespeare Walla, the production of Shakespeare in India, has had a colossal effect in unifying India, In other words, you know, this is a little bit of an answer, isn't it, to agreeing with Michael Bogdanov that there isn't ambiguity. There is a clear-cut assertion of the way political power works. It's corrupting, it's damaging, but also it's possible to enact it with integrity. But at the same time, the stereotypes are there, but it's possible to play Caliban with dignity and all the other controversial parts. And I think that's also a bit of a message from this play, the corruption. In her case, you know, her burying her child right at the beginning was a brilliant touch, wasn't it? It sort of threw a whole new light on why she is so vindictive and bitter and cruel.
Children and succession are central to the play. Well, I'm afraid that I've been told to bring it to an end at about this time. So on behalf of the British Council, I want to thank you all for coming. And I want you to say a big thank you to our distinguished guest, Professor Andrew Murphy.
I just want to quickly say before we go, thank you all for coming. Thank you to our guests, Phil George and Professor Andrew Murphy. If you want to talk about the discussion on social media, we ask on behalf of the British Council that you use the hashtag Shakespeare Lives, which is the season, and that you mention at BC Wales, that's British Council, and at Chapter Tweets. And please come along next week for our next film. It's exactly the same time next week. We'll be showing a West Side Story, and we'll be talking about Shakespeare and its effect on the modern musical. So thank you very much for coming, and see you next week.
Thank you.